Great. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate you all joining us today. This is our second webinar series for the Fluvial Hazard Zone program, Colorado Water Conservation Fluvial Hazard Zone program. And today, we'll kind of do a little introduction here. And Katie, actually, I will have you drive the slides because I'm going to keep having to admit people while I'm also presenting.
Okay. I'll try to do that.
Okay, I'll just wait a second for that. So today we're going to talk about the Bear River, and Ethan Alder with OTAC is going to be presenting on that. So we'll give him an introduction in a minute, but we're going to do a little bit of background about the Fluvial Hazard Zone program with the Colorado Water Conservation Board before we get started. Okay, so Katie, you're presenting. Great.
Does that look okay?
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, let's get started, and we'll do a brief introduction to the program, and then we'll hand it over to Ethan. So myself, Michael Blazevich, I'm Joel Schultes, and Michael Blazevich and Katie Yacht. We're part of the technical assistant team for the Colorado Water Conservation Board and help develop and run the Fluvial Hazard Zone program here in Colorado, which we'll be talking a little bit more about this morning. Next slide, please. So we've launched this webinar series this year. There's been a lot of new fluvial hazard zones being mapped across the state as part of the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. You can register for this webinar series. Back one slide, please. Using that QR code, and we'll just add you to a mailing list that we have. So I think most of you have been on that list, but if you're not, go ahead and scan that code. We'd love to get your contact information. We'll keep you up to date. So we'll have a few more this fall, and we'll be sending out updates as those develop. Oh, and we should plug the next one. Let's go ahead and plug the next one. So the next one is in August, and we'll be talking about adopting FHZ maps and applying them at the local scale. So how can we use them for land use planning, zoning, development review, that sort of thing. So we'll have some guests come on to talk about those applications on the ground. And then following that in September, we'll talk about an actual application of that with the city of Greeley. Also upcoming, we have a training that's going to be happening at CASFM this fall in Steamboat Springs. So there's the information. Registration is open, so go ahead and check that out if you're interested in going to CASFM, Colorado Association of Stormwater and Floodplain Managers. And so we'll have this training. It'll be a 3-hour training on what the FHZ is, how it's mapped, and how it's applied, with the emphasis on applications. All right, so in our last webinar, we talked about FHZ and RAPs, so Wildfire Ready Action Plans. And Katie and Michael gave us an overview of what stream corridor hazards are, especially after fire, and how streams can be more geomorphically responsive or hazardous after fires and floods, post-fire flooding. Then they talked about how we can use FHZ maps in RAPs, the action plans, to assess susceptibility and plan for that, where to map the FHZ in a RAP, because RAPs often cover really broad geographic areas, and we're not going to map every little first order, second order, third order stream, maybe most of the third order streams. So they talked about strategies for that, how to apply it within the RAP for project development, and ultimately lead to actions that would come out of the FHZ mapping. So mitigation projects and other planning tools that can be used. So if you missed that webinar, you can scan that code, that QR code, and it'll bring you to our YouTube channel. If you aren't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do. We've got other trainings up there, background material on how to map the FHZ and all the stuff that we produce, so check it out. All right, a little bit of background on the Fluvial Hazard Zone program. It's under the Colorado Water Conservation Board, Watershed and Flood Protection section. So we work Sturm and Kevin Hauk and Andrea and Stephen Rees in the program. We've got a website, the coloradofhz.com. If you haven't been on it already, please check it out. And it's related to the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program in that FHZ's mapping, fluvial hazard zone mapping, is part of the hazard assessments and susceptibility analysis. So as watersheds burn, when they burn, they can produce a lot more water and sediment and debris, and fluvial geomorphic hazards or river changing in response to floods is a really important hazard to evaluate. So this is just an overview of what the watershed and flood protection section is. And there's Colorado Water Plan grants and restoration grants that can fund the mapping of fluvial hazard zones as part of a stream management plan or restoration work that your group or organization might be doing. So they can be mapped and funded through the state outside of the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. However, our focus on the first couple of webinars here has been how FHCs relate to Wildfire Ready Watersheds. We wanted to give a little timeline to the broader audience out there, stakeholder groups and mappers, on how the FHC program was developed over the years. And it really started and was galvanized in 2013 in response to Colorado Front Range flood. And a lot of the damage, and I would wager that the majority of the damage of that flood, in response to that flood across the Front Range, was from fluvial geomorphic impacts, not just inundation flooding, not structures getting wet and washed away, but channels changing, sediment depositing, rivers avulsing and braiding. And that really opens the state's eyes and all the people affected's eyes that we need to understand how our rivers respond to floods dynamically and how they change. And one of the statistics we found was that and this is kind of a very squishy statistic here, but of the impacted structures, about 50% of them were outside of the 100-year floodplain or the 1% AEP floodplain. And certainly some of the floods had broad, bigger magnitudes than the 1% AEP, but nevertheless, a lot of the impact were due to rivers moving, depositing sediment and debris, eroding. So that led to the state working with CWCB and ultimately funding a natural hazard mapping fund. This updated FEMA floodplain maps, LIDAR surveys of all the stream corridors that were affected. And it also established the fluvial hazard zone program. So it funded the development of the protocol, which we all worked on with a lot of others, as well as started 8 fluvial hazard zone maps in 8 pilot communities. So that protocol was published in 2020. And if you go to coloradofhz.com, you can find it there, along with a lot of other information about how to do it. And if you're a community, if you want to do it, how you can apply it. And then finally, the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program was initiated in 2022. And the state funded a statewide susceptibility analysis, as well as the development of the RAP program, the action plan. So that's what we're here to talk about today. As you all are either sponsoring Wildfire Ready Watershed action plans and may be involved in mapping or dealing with the results of fluvial hazard zone maps. Since 2018, fluvial hazard zones have been mapped in approximately 20 counties across the state, and that number is changing every few months. So the dark blue represents maps, fluvial hazard zones that we've mapped. If you go back one slide real quick.
Sorry.
That have been mapped just for mapping the fluvial hazard zone. And then the light blue or teal represents those that have been mapped for RAPs, or Wildfire Ready Action Plans. And so we're collecting information on all of fluvial hazard zone maps that have been completed. And this is a little map that shows where they have, what watersheds they've been mapped within. And if you want to take a few seconds to look at this, and if you're on this call and you don't see your community or watershed represented here, please chat us or email us. We'd love to add you to the database. All right, a couple more slides just on broadly how fluvial hazard zone maps can be utilized. We're talking about hazards primarily, where rivers are responding to floods dynamically and moving across their stream corridor. But we also think about these maps and the applications of them as fluvial opportunity zones. And within these opportunity zones, these stream corridors that are dynamic, we can use these maps to understand how to plan our communities, to think about how development occurs within stream and river corridors, look for opportunities for conservation and restoration. And this could be reconnecting floodplains that might not be fully functional, to have multi-benefit projects. It could be open space and flood hazard mitigation. We can also understand where we might have conflicts with infrastructure, bridges and embankments and utilities. And so when we need to replace infrastructure, we can site it in appropriate locations informed by the fluvial hazard zone. Of course, for disaster preparedness and communication is really important, and understanding within your community where you might have critical infrastructure, evacuation zones that could be impacted by the fluvial hazard zone, as well as communicating things like where are debris flow zones, areas where flash flooding might change the river and impact certain communities. The fluvial hazard zone can be an important tool for that. Finally, if you are a floodplain administrator or work with one, these maps can be used as part of the community rating system with the National Flood Insurance Program. You can actually get points in that system and bring down insurance premiums for your community by mapping and adopting components of the fluvial hazard zone in your land use and floodplain programs. Here's just a map of some of these applications in the Grand Valley where I and others have mapped the fluvial hazard zone. And we're just looking at areas where we can have and encourage channel migration as part of natural river processes, identifying where we have bank armoring and where we might be able to remove it, planning for migration, meaning where do we have impacts down the road for infrastructure, and where might we want to take some actions within the river corridor to mitigate those impacts as rivers migrating. And then also opportunities for floodplain reconnection. This is a floodplain reconnection project can help with flood hazards, inundation hazards, help with the natural environment. So we have endangered fish here that require floodplain habitat, and also provide open space for the community. Finally, fluvial opportunity zones are everywhere in our watersheds when we think about the RAP process. And here's this figure that kind of shows all the things that can go wrong after a flood occurs in a fire burned watershed. But there's a lot of opportunities in here as well, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And those opportunities include identifying these are all the outcomes essentially that you would hope to have from a RAP process. Where do we have infrastructure that is susceptible to post-fire flooding and debris flows and river movement? Where do we have critical infrastructure and water intakes? Where can we do restoration projects up higher in the watershed to mitigate these impacts of sediment pulses that could come through? So a lot of opportunities within our watersheds as we map and learn about them through the RAP process. So today I'm going to turn it over to Ethan in a few seconds here. We're going to be learning about the Bear River RAP and the fluvial hazard zone mapping that OTAC has worked on in that project. So Ethan's going to give us a rundown of how we did the mapping, components of that mapping, some of the technical challenges and the judgment calls that are required in this process, and then the applications in terms of susceptibility analysis and project development. So we can stop sharing, Katie, and then Ethan can start, and you can take it away, Ethan. Thank you.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you. All right, let me share. Cool. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Great. Well, yeah, with that, I want to walk through this case study of the Bear River and the FHZ delineation we did for it as a part of the Bear River Wildfire Ready Action Plan. So my name is Ethan Alder. I'm an OTAC, or I'm with OTAC. I'm a fluvial geomorphologist. In this project, we were working for the Upper Yampa Water Conservancy District with Andy Rossi and Emily Lowell, and working with JW and Associates, specifically Brad Peel and Abby McNamara. And I just want to shout them all out because all integral to this process and helping us, come to conclusions together, figure out, how to move through this process and, what data to utilize from it. So I wanted to, just as also an introduction to myself, I know previous mapping efforts had been mentioned. This project here on Bear River was not my first. I had also participated in some of those, early studies, in First Creek and Box Elder Creek. Most of my previous efforts had been concentrated around the Front Range and out Denver Metro Corridor. So the Happy Canyon Creek, Cherry Creek confluence, and then Bear Creek. Jumping into this general project, so actually just again, so we're grounded in space. This project is upstream of the town of Yampa. The Bear River flows into the Yampa River, so we're close to Steamboat Springs, specifically upstream of the town of Yampa. So this is what this basin looks like. It's 2 Huck 12s or 54 square miles. We're upstream of the town of Yampa. The basin itself kind of has a forested headwaters with beaver meadows and beads on a string up in the upper basin. And then as we get closer to the town of Yampa, we have a larger glacial valley that contains older terraces as well. So moving through this at a high level, generally the values at risk that we see here, there are 3 large reservoirs in the upper basin. We have Yamcola Reservoir, Bear Lake, and Stillwater Reservoir. I don't have it called out here, but closer to the lower, midway through the lower basin, we have a water treatment facility. The lower basin contains a lot of agricultural infrastructure, including head gates and ditches. We have the town of Yampa itself, and then the roads to navigate this basin. So one of the first things we had to do, and it was helpful, to do some of the other, I know JW and Associates had done some of the wildfire hazard mapping and burn severity mapping, debris flow stuff leading into this to help try to inform, okay, where are our values at risk, and where do we want to do this FHZ mapping to have more specific data. So we worked closely with them and with Upper Yampa, and ultimately we decided to focus on the lowest 10 miles. So, generally between the reservoirs and the town of Yampa. And we thought that this location correlated to where fluvial hazards may most impact values at risk. So again, water treatment facility, roads, agricultural infrastructure. And then other things that kind of came into play was thinking about land management. So the colored polygons that you see here, with the exception of the hatched one, which is ultimately our FHZ analysis extent, shows land management practices. And so we have national forest and national forest wilderness up in the upper basin. And so thinking about that and what projects we could do in those locations also contributed to our selection of analysis area. And then lastly, we are lower in the watershed, so we do have higher flows. And again, with all this infrastructure, there was no FEMA mapping here. And so we also wanted to do this FHG analysis, and our hydraulics analysis for this area also had a similar extent. To provide a little bit of information on, where we can expect hazards in the lower basin. So I want to show now a few slides from JW and Associates analyses, about wildfire hazards. So when we look at these, in the lower basin, we don't have as high of our, wildfire hazards. We don't have the same amount of forests that we do in the upper basin. We don't have the same slopes. It's much steeper up here. And so we do have these higher hazards in the upper basin, where we may have, more burn severity, more water running off more quickly, more sediment creation, debris flows. And that's certainly important. We certainly have projects that are associated with these hazards, but we felt that with, and here's debris flows, so maybe telling us about where some sediment generation could come from as well. And that is all important, and we incorporated it, but ultimately we had to pick where to do our fluvial hazard zones. And again, for the reasons I previously named, we decided that the lower basin seemed like the most appropriate place to do this analysis. And here's this overall susceptibility risk analysis map. It's somewhat biased because this is the end result. And so it includes our fluvial hazard zone delineation as one of the hazards that goes into this mapping. But with the concentration of values at risk, we decided to map it there. So now I want to jump into the actual mapping process itself. What sort of data went into it, what decisions we had to make. So first, this first slide just has the inputs we used. So generally we use 2016 LiDAR for this process. And from that, we created a relative elevation model, which is a really useful tool just in mapping different geomorphic features. And especially when it comes to mapping something like an active stream corridor is pretty vital. I mean, here, we'll talk about this image on the right here at the end of these slides, or sorry, at the end of this slide. The relative elevation model will tell you your elevation above the nearest drainage, so above the water surface of, in this case, the Bear River. We also looked at superficial geology at a 1 to 100,000 scale map. And in this lower basin, again, this kind of story of data that impact the FHZ mapping itself is that we have some glacial deposits. Again, we're in a large glacial valley with some older Pleistocene terraces that are maybe more historically where the stream made its adjustments, and then a more narrowly deposited Holocene alluvium that generally correlates more to our fluvial hazard zones. That's kind of how we incorporated superficial geology. We also used, concurrent to these analyses, OTAC was performing a hydraulics analysis using a 2D model based upon hydrology provided by JW and Associates. And similarly, having that as a data point to see where is the flow going, is it spilling out of this corridor at all, kind of helped us make some determinations. We also looked at historical aerial imagery to see the extent to which the channel center line and different aspects of the corridor were changing, if at all. And then the other thing we used were existing infrastructure, including roads and ditches, knowing that, at large floods, these ditches are something that streams can capture. They create topographic lows in the valley and provide areas, that have the potential for flow to go down during large events and sediment. So moving into the mapping, let's start with the active stream corridor. To map this active stream corridor, we utilize the fluvial signature protocol. Oh, and excuse me, let me actually jump back a slide. I want to go over some of the lines on the map here. So we have this yellow line is the active stream corridor. The orange line beyond it is the fluvial hazard buffer. This red dashed line is an avulsion hazard zone, which is a type of auxiliary fluvial hazard we will talk about in a couple slides. And then we have a black dashed line, which is the channel center line of the Bear River, and a gray dashed line, which is ditches. And most of that symbology will hold for the following slides. Okay, so back to the active stream corridor, we utilized the fluvial signatures protocol as it felt like there were fluvial signatures for us to read in the floodplain. Looking at this relative elevation model, you can see the channel center line, but then you can see other fluvial signatures within it that show where the stream may have previously occupied some high flow paths, but as the stream generally moves across its valley, these are some of the fluvial signatures that are left behind. So the relative elevation model is pretty helpful, both just to show where are these fluvial signatures being held, but then also just as a as a mapping technique, we saw that generally So relative elevation model, height above the Bear River center line. So if you have 1, you're 1 foot above it. If you're 5, you're 5 feet above it. Generally, if you were at 6 to 8 feet above that Bear River water surface, that seemed to be correlating visually with the edge of the active stream corridor, which then is very useful for then mapping the active stream corridor. And I say 6 to 8 feet because it is a range. We are in a natural system, and especially, going from the upstream extent of our analysis to the downstream extent of our analysis, which has generally provided a guide or something to shoot for. We also digitized that Holocene alluvium from the geology maps that also, provided some other lines on a map. Where was the hydraulics being contained? That's, another set of lines, another piece of evidence. And then we kind of just had to use our own professional judgment to determine, ultimately what should the extent of the active stream corridor be. And then field verification is pretty vital because, as some of you may have noticed, while we do have a concentration of fluvial signatures within the active stream corridor, these up on this terrace ultimately, they look like fluvial signatures too. Should they be included? They're being mapped as Pleistocene deposits. That's a pretty long time ago. Is that the design timescale we're thinking about here? So that's where professional judgment comes in, different conversations, and then again, field verification. So in this next slide, we have 2 photos in the same spot. This upper photo, we're just standing on a bridge, looking downstream at the Bear River, and then this fluvial, the active stream corridor and terrace on river right. And then this bottom photo, same spot. I'm just standing, 20 feet over valley right. And so this was the type of thing when we had our field verification day to hop out in specific locations that were easily accessible to try to identify, were we correct or did we feel comfortable with where we were calling the edge of the active stream corridor and the start of, maybe a terrace that we don't think should be included in that mapping. And yes, it's hard to read these landscapes sometimes, obviously, because of, influence of agriculture and land manipulation. But, standing here, it did seem like we do have a pretty clear break in slope, especially on this lower photo, with everything to the left sloping down towards the riparian corridor and everything to the right being flatter, maybe not having been activated. Again, maybe supporting some of that geologic mapping and elevation mapping that we looked at. So ultimately a judgment call, but field verification was helpful in this process, vital even. So then moving from the active stream corridor to the fluvial hazard buffer, there's this handy tape table in the FHE delineation protocol that sort of tells you, what you should utilize for your buffer. So this buffer just kind of accounts for different hazards that can occur on the extent of your corridor in terms of like eroding, failing banks, some deposition. And looking at this table, we had a quick question that we answered pretty quickly, but I think it's helpful just with these decisions. So we have this type 1 standard and this type 3 large snowmelt streams. And that was a decision point. It's, are we going to map with the type 1 standard or the large snowmelt streams? But in the appendices, it mentions that type 3 has the guidance of your corridor should have under 0.5% slope. Our drainage has a slope of 2.2%. And so I don't think it really qualified as being large. And ultimately, we went with the type 1 standard. So the way that works is it asks you to look at valley confinement. So is your channel confined, or is the valley width, channel width ratio less than 5, partially confined, that ratio being between 5 and 12, and unconfined? And then based upon that, again, with confined, there's probably more energy, more potential to do fluvial hazards on the extents of your corridor. That gets a factor of 4 stream widths wide, partially confined 3 stream widths wide, and unconfined 2 stream width wide. So we looked throughout the basin, took a smattering of width measurements, knowing that this is a natural river and widths change, and we assessed that generally 20 feet appeared to be appropriate. So we then mapped where these transitions between confined, partially confined, and unconfined. And then based upon that, built out these buffers of 4, 3, or 2 times wide. Then based on that data, because we don't want, big juts out or in, rapid changes in this buffer width, we did some manual smoothing. And then we also just reviewed it for other areas that should have been manually expanded. I can think of one instance that we don't really need to focus on, but we felt that there was enhanced scour risk because there was artificial confinement from a historical road, and we decided to include that in the fluvial hazard buffer, if not in the active stream corridor. So active stream corridor, fluvial hazard buffer are the two bigger components that are pretty much always included. And then there are these auxiliary hazards that are included if they are present in your basin. I'm going to talk about 2, one very briefly, and then one in more depth. This basin did have some alluvial fans or one alluvial fan within where we mapped as a steeper tributary comes in. That one, we mapped it. It wasn't really influencing the edge of the stream corridor so much, so we mapped it, and that was that. But then I want to focus on avulsion hazard zones a bit. So an avulsion hazard zone tries to tell us about where avulsions could occur or where a stream may find a new course across a floodplain or terrace. And we actually mapped 3 avulsion hazard zones. Only 2 are present on this one. There's another one more upstream. Only 2 are present on this map. And we're going to walk through 4 cross sections associated. You'll see it on the map. You'll see the cross section itself. We want to walk through why we mapped them the way we mapped them. Cross section 1 will be in the upper avulsion hazard zone. Cross section 2 will be approximately here at the start of the second hazard zone. 3 will be here, still in that same avulsion hazard zone, but further downstream. And then 4 will be down here by the town of Yampa. So this first avulsion hazard zone is relatively small, but we felt important to map, and I think was a good indicator of where, having a ditch in your floodplain also can result in an avulsion hazard zone being mapped. And so here we see the active stream corridor. We see a good relatively natural channel that's been able to shift across its valley. We see several different places where flow can concentrate, historical flow paths. The actual flow path itself, I believe, is here. And then we look over to the right, we have a little bit of a berm. And then we have the ditch, which is not that different in elevation from the stream itself. And we thought about that, and we thought about, well, if you have, some deposition towards the main channel, you have some high flows being able to access that river right action. Yeah, it does seem realistic or possible that that could result in an avulsion. And that seems especially important because it's not super highlighted on here, but you can see County Road 7 goes across that ditch. And we drove over that ditch, and we stood here. We looked towards the floodplain, and we said, yeah, this is all pretty flat. It definitely seems possible. So we wanted to map it. Next, we have this larger avulsion hazard zone. And the cross sections are where these black lines are. Excuse me for not saying that previously. So we have the stream flowing here. Again, not even in the lowest flow path in its floodplain. That being said, LIDAR isn't water penetrating. And so depending on depth, it could be deeper. But similarly, we have multiple flow paths going across the active stream corridor, which is good. And but then again, here looking, we do have a ditch on the right side again. This area that we mapped, we have this higher terrace. But it does seem like if flow were to be able to get over here, it is just as low, if not lower, what also tells us that we could have an avulsion potential on our hands. So, and we also mapped this as one really large avulsion hazard zone that you may remember from a couple slides ago goes a very long ways on Valley, right? And so we thought it was important to think about kind of the start of that and where flow could go. So if flow gets in there, this previous cross section we were just looking at is again up here by this, by the start of this avulsion hazard zone. So if flow were able to get up here and stay here, once you get over here, there's this adjacent drainage, Phillips Creek, and as you can see from this, if flow again can get out, that's a pretty aggressive slope down towards the Phillip Creek corridor. And so that also seems like something where you could have a large avulsion. If you have enough flow able to like punch a hole through this terrace and flow get out, you could have, you know, capture down the terrace towards Phillips Creek. And I'm going to jump to some hydraulics results. And sorry, there's a change in perspective here. We had north towards the top of the screen, and now we have north going over to the right of the screen. Part of the flood hazards, or sorry, hydraulics modeling shows that, especially along roads, if flow is able to get out, it does appear to spill down towards Phillips Creek. And then also we have these areas of shallow flooding, which were these like discontinuous polygons in the mapping that also show that, you know, when, you know, flow does get out on these terraces, it seems at higher flow events. And so we wanted to think about that as well. And it felt like avulsion hazard zones were a good way to kind of convey that information. Lastly, we have an avulsion hazard zone by the town of Yampa. So in this one, we have flow shifting down towards valley left towards the town of Yampa. And similarly, we have, to the last image, we have, you know, the Bear River corridor. And we have a bit of, you know, a high flow berm or terrace, but then this shifting of flow down towards the town of Yampa. And this cross section you can see goes right down First Street. So if flow again were able to spill out and flow down towards the town of Yampa, that could result in flooding. It could result in deposition. If enough flow is going, you could have some, you know, scour as well and erosion. So these are all things we wanted to think about. And we also acknowledge that they're being mapped as avulsion hazard zones. We worked very closely with Andy and Emily at Upper Yampa, and with Brad and Abby, with JW and Associates, to think through how do we convey this, because ultimately it's Andy and Emily who are going to receive the phone calls and communicate this to their stakeholders, saying, you know, do we have a hazard here? And it's hard to say. I mean, we explicitly do not map risk in terms of like an odds of this happening. And I don't really know when it comes to things like this avulsion hazard. Can it happen? But or you know, at what flow, at how catastrophic an event needs to occur for this sort of hazard to happen? But you know, it felt like as a part of due diligence, it's important to note that this is something that can happen and possibly something to invest in with regards to projects, to try to make sure that if we do have a catastrophic flow event, we are doing the best we can to prevent some hazards. So jumping to conclusions and potential projects that came out of this mapping process, we have 8 road crossings and portions of, you know, county roads within the fluvial hazard zone as a whole. So the active stream corridor, fluvial hazard buffer, and avulsion hazard zone, which is really important because this, you know, a basin like this, there's really mainly one road in, one road out. And so if you have issues with that, if you have bridge failure, et cetera, like we need to think about evacuation routes. There are different projects we need to think about. And so we also acknowledge the potential for avulsions both into Phillips Creek or towards the town of Yampa. And then there are other things like water treatment facility, which this photo, this is us standing in front of the water treatment facility, buildings, headgates, and ditches, all within the fluvial hazard zone, and all things we need to, you know, consider, try to prioritize, think through. Yeah, what programs and actions can we put into place based upon this plan? And I also really want to shout out communication. So just our team worked very closely together to give frequent project updates and frequent communication, especially with things that are delicate, like what hazards can appear in communities, making sure that we're conveying it in an effective and respectful manner. Again, we don't want to raise alarm bells for no reason. We don't want to like sow distrust or anything like that. Just trying to accurately convey with the best, you know, intention, best data we have, what these hazards are, what they might impact. I like this photo. This is in, as I was saying, there are many beaver meadows in the upper basin as well. We're standing here actually where wildfire risk above this is higher in the basin. This is one of the areas that has the highest potential for burning and sediment production and changes in hydrology. And so making sure that we looked in these areas for good, beaver meadows and sponges. This beaver meadow is actually like healthier than we thought it was going to be when we got out there, but how do we monitor that and make sure that continues to function as it would? So an important, geomorphic water sediment question, but wasn't quite asked as a part of this specific fluvial hazard zone analysis. So then back to the potential projects from this fluvial hazard zone analysis, we definitely looked at some culvert capacity upgrades to think through, can we better convey water and sediment through culverts and avoid situations where they plug and fail and cause flooding? We thought a bit about potential offset levees. So again, specifically like with the town of Yampa, if we have this downward sloping area, is there something we can do with levees or berms to help try to cut off that flow if we do have shallow flooding? And then lastly, mitigation in the upper basin. So both things to help as a part of the wildfire already action plan, just make sure that we are doing the best we can to minimize these hazards in the event of a burn, to reduce things like burn severity, to make sure, like that last photo I shared of that upper beaver meadow, are sponges in place to be able to absorb the energy and sediment and water being created in these post-burn scenarios. But yeah, these are all, I think these are kind of the questions we asked and attempted to answer, kind of looking at this fluvial hazard zone analysis. And so with that, I'm hoping we can, open this up, have a bit of a discussion about our mapping process, to see if you all have any questions about any of the decisions we made. And then also just general, curiosity, especially with these avulsion hazard zones. As I mentioned, I had mapped, I think, 5 fluvial hazard zones prior to this, and this was the first one where we really had these larger avulsion hazard zone risks. How to think through that, how to think through, if we have a value at risk in an avulsion hazard zone, how to think about that, knowing that the odds of it being impacted are probably lower than the odds of something that is directly in the active stream corridor. But yeah, that's all I got. So I wanted to open it up.
Thanks so much, Ethan. Really appreciate it and really enjoyed the in-depth discussion on your mapping process and outcomes. All right, so we're going to open up for questions. Please use the raise your hand tool if you want to ask them in live, or you can put them in the chat. And I can start with Ben Beal, who asked about how to model flows post-fire versus current conditions, and a little bit outside of the fluvial hazard zone discussion, but really important for the hazard analysis for RAPS. And I'll just kind of at a very high level say that we can use maps of wildfire intensity that's modeled and projected should a fire occur in a watershed, to then understand and estimate changes in runoff generating capacity of a particular area within the watershed. So essentially you make a hydrologic model under existing conditions and then change the land use type or the amount of water that would run off a particular area within that model. So we have kind of a long history of doing that type of estimation and getting post-fire hydrology that way. So it's an approximation and an estimate. And then Ethan, a question for you from Ben was, how do you factor reservoir impoundment on flows and post-fire flood risk?
Yeah, it's a good question. So our team handled the hydraulics, and JW and Associates kind of handed us the hydrology. And I think we did think through it, but so our flood model or our hydraulics, 2D hydraulics model extents were similar to our fluvial hazard zone, and so they were downstream of the reservoirs, and so I do not believe actually the hydrology took into account the capacity of the reservoirs able to hold the water for the purposes of this analysis, or sediment. So it kind of assumes that they aren't there for the purposes of this analysis. There's no attenuation that they're providing. That being said, we don't want it to function as like a dam break model. I know that they actually did do a dam break analysis of EM Colo, but for the purposes of this analysis, we assumed we just have our hydrology coming in downstream of this, and I don't think that those numbers accounted for the attenuation of those reservoirs. We also, for what it's worth, there is a fairly large drainage that comes in from the North Coal Creek that comes in downstream of the reservoirs. But it's definitely, we have in our hydraulics memo, and the hydrologic memo acknowledges too, like there is further study that could occur here to help try to refine these models.
Is there anyone from the JW Associates team that would like to speak to that too?
Hey,
I know
this
that-
is Abby. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Abby from JW Associates. I think Ethan said it well. We were kind of focused on, the worst case scenario and figuring that the reservoir would just be passing flows down, assuming it would be full with water. So that's why we decided to just go with basically assume that the rivers would be flowing pretty high into the reservoir and passing that flow down.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Other questions from the group? Okay, we've got Dan. Let's go ahead and take your question, then I'll take a chat question.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Ethan, for the presentation. I guess my question can be for either Ethan or maybe a little bit of the Fluvial hazard zone development team. When you're looking at those cross sections that you had selected, active stream corridor versus the the avulsion zones areas, you could probably fairly easily argue that maybe those avulsion areas are actually part of the active stream corridor. So it's a little bit of a thinking about what's your baseline for what's considered active within recent time periods. Is it the last couple of decades, or is it maybe a little bit more like centuries? And I think if you were to apply the Washington Channel Migration Zone kind of approach, we would probably lump those avulsion areas within the active channel zone, but it would also be still labeled as an avulsion hazard risk. And so kind of an open-ended question, but yeah, just kind of curious on you guys' thought process going through that to separate that as not being part of the active stream corridor, but as something separate.
Yeah, I think for me, and then Joel, Katie, I would be curious to get your perspective on it as well. But I think specifically at the geologic map and seeing that it did seem like there was a similar elevation in the relative elevation model on these terraces, it did make us feel that this was, somewhat of a different thing. And again, we're not necessarily applying risk here, but it did feel like, well, it's useful for me to say that this woolly ditch headgate is in the active stream corridor versus a road out here is in the avulsion hazard zone. I think that just in terms of mentally for me an odds thing and where we should kind of concentrate our actions, it made it helpful to make that to distinguish between those two things.
Good, yeah, good. And Ethan, I liked how you're talking about, we've got this active stream corridor that the definition, if you look it up on the protocol, is it's the corridor within which the river is kind of migrating and actively influencing under the present flow and sediment regime. So when you're looking at a glaciated landscape, and this is for everyone, Dan, I know you know these things, but often we have rivers that have, after the glaciers have retreated, our flow and sediment supply has gone down. And so the river is typically in size within that former glaciated floodplain. And so that's what Ethan and his team mapped. As far as saying what is avulsion hazard zone versus active stream corridor, I think this is a great example where you can see that the flow path primarily leaves that active stream corridor and goes elsewhere. Maybe it reconnects somewhere downstream, but you can kind of see a distinction of historical terraces that were left by the last glaciation and where the channel's moving contemporaneously. But I think it is often a judgment call. Do you incorporate a ditch or not? Do you incorporate a gravel pond? Often we're incorporating things that might not have been in the active stream corridor, and then humans come in, change the landscape, and then provide opportunities for the river to then kind of access those areas.
And I'll add to that too. I was going to say exactly what Joel was saying, is that, you know, when you're weighing to map something, whether it's active stream corridor or a Vol'jin hazard zone, you also have to consider the driving force behind a channel movement, and, you know, kind of whether that's a natural process that is in line with the current hydrology and sediment regimes, or if it's something that's maybe a little bit outside of that, which in this case was some human infrastructure. And so kind of, you know, looking at the force and the forcing of the avulsion is important as well. And additionally, something else that we try to consider, I don't know if it was exactly the case here, is that oftentimes when we see avulsion zones that are outside the active stream corridor, as we would map it, there is a space between them. So it's not one continuous swath of land that goes all the way across the valley. There's the active stream corridor. There's kind of an island that's typically the historic terracine, and then there's that avulsion zone on the other side. So it's kind of, you know, it's a combination of all of those factors as to what really makes sense given the specific geology and geography that you're working in.
And speaking to contemporary sediment and flow regimes, a wildfire can change that. Obviously, when you have a wildfire, you have a lot more sediment and a lot more potential water moving through the system that could then encourage avulsions. And then Caroline asked about avulsion hazard zones through a town. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of examples of that, simply because we develop our towns near stream corridors. And Katie can probably speak to examples where this has happened. Lyons is an example I can speak to, where we had avulsions move through towns. I think Estes Park has experienced some of this simply because it's developed within numerous streams coming into the same area. So yes, it unfortunately does happen and can happen. David Rothwell asked, was sediment modeled in RAS or HMS, and the sediment deposition considered in, I guess, sediment modeling, or thinking about how sediment routing occurs through a stream corridor?
It was not for the purposes of this analysis. We were looking pretty high level. There are lots of ways the model, I think we acknowledged, could have been refined. I think cell size of the analysis in the floodplain, again, you saw we had those wide areas of shallow flooding. We could have investigated that more with additional, there are additional analyses that could do, but for this first cut, we did not include sediment deposition or sediment in the model.
And that's often a high, kind of more in-depth level of study, the hydrologic and hydraulic modeling that occurs for the RAPs. You're doing it for a broad area, and so often, not always maybe, but often we don't have the resources to do modeling that includes sediment. However, I know some groups are doing kind of bulking ratios where you consider sediment in the flow that would then add to the volume of the flow. So it is a thing that can be considered in these processes. And then it's just as far as like thinking about sediment routing through a watershed for RAPs, I know a lot of folks are thinking about it at a kind of qualitative or quasi-quantitative level. Perhaps GWA's got some routines that think about sediment routing from watershed to watershed, and where you have zones where sediment would fall out in deposits. And it sounds like this group was thinking about that in their upper reaches where they have beaver meadows.
Yeah, and that was definitely our focus again when we went out to that beaver meadow. I showed a photo of where, again, we were, happy to see that the beaver meadow appeared to be functioning relatively well. And with that in mind, we, definitely recommend monitoring it, knowing that it was located where we think a lot of sediment would be created, where we have more gentle slopes. A lot of these drainages on the northern slopes were steeper. And so putting in, a wood structure at a 20% steep reach might not really function as the way we want it to. But I think making sure we're taking care of those areas where we think that that deposition can occur is really, really important, and things we definitely thought through. But again, just with where we focused our fluvial hazard zone analysis, what wasn't what we were focusing on. I think here similarly, this is on the main stem bear, believed between two of the reservoirs. And so if we have sediment coming in here, we see this, awesome kind of valley spanning beaver pond and beaver lodge that we have here. And then downstream of that, it is fairly single thread. I do think there are things we can do to find more connection areas and enhance that floodplain connectivity and make sure that where we have these larger beads where the valley opens up, we can encourage flow to slow down and there to be deposition, taking care of those areas. So where the sediment's being produced and where it goes is definitely something we thought of. But when it came down to mapping the fluvial hazard zone, we're kind of just operating under the assumption that at the upstream end of our analysis, we have all this flow coming in based upon hydrology and hydraulic modeling. And with that would come sediment. So also, we definitely thought about the fact that our valley slowly opened up as we got towards the town of Yampa, which I think is probably kind of a helpful thing. We probably have slow deposition as we have stream power reducing as we move downstream in terms of valley confinement. Whereas if there were more abrupt changes in that, we might expect there to be some more pockets where there would be large areas of deposition.
And Ethan, I appreciate your point of, don't take your beaver wetlands for granted. You have them, they're there, they're functioning relatively well. Maybe there's some support and work that could be done to expand their reach, but also make sure that they're being taken care of and aren't getting extirpated. You are lucky to have that, and maybe a lot of other folks might have valleys that are incised and dried and could use some restoration treatments to encourage beaver to recolonize them for that purpose. Let's see if we're going to do one more question and then we can wrap this up. If anyone wants to put it in the chat or raise their hands, and then we can tell you about what's next. Great. Well, I'm Ethan, if you don't mind, stop sharing. I'm going to share my screen and just tell you all, first of all, thanks for showing up and listening in, and we appreciate your attention and your time. I'm going to just remind folks that we have coming up in August. Let's see if I can do this. Talk and click at the same time. Coming up in August, we're going to have a session on August 12th at 10. And I will invite this group. If you've registered, I'll have your email address, and I can make sure you're in that invite list. So please register here. If you just logged on and hadn't registered yet, it won't have your email address. But we'll be talking about generally how fluvial hazard zone maps can be adopted and used at the community scale, the local scale. And then we'll talk about an example of that with the city of Greeley and their river management initiative. August 12th, 10 a.m. And then you can also see us, the team, Katie, myself, Michael, Chris Sturm, and we'll be talking about a little more in depth about how to map and how to apply the maps. So this will be at CASMM September, I think the 24th. It's the Tuesday of that week. And we'll be there at 1 for 3 hours, and hope to see you there.
A quick thing. We're also going to be at the Sustaining Colorado Watersheds Conference as a Monday workshop, I believe.
So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, that's we don't quite have the content for that figured out, but stay tuned. Those workshops are free in Avon.
Oh yeah, you don't have to register for the conference to be there, correct?
Yeah, you can just show up. It's great. Okay, thank you all. We'll see you
Thanks,
next
everyone.
month.
Bye. And we can also stay on if anyone has any other questions.
Perfect.